Hey everyone. The next structure of the alimentary canal that we're going to move on to is the stomach. We just talked about the esophagus, and the esophagus is this long muscular tube that runs down the thoracic cavity, past the heart, past the lungs. It runs through the diaphragm, and it delivers food into the next structure of the alimentary canal, which is the stomach. And the stomach is a temporary holding tank where we're going to begin the digestion of proteins. So protein digestion is going to begin here. And we're also going to mechanically break this food down into a paste that we call chyme. So the stomach is a holding tank. And in fact, food is going to stay here for about 2 to 4 hours. So my first question is, what structures allow the stomach to serve as a holding tank, to actually maintain that food within the stomach and not just allow it to pass down through into the intestine? What about up here at the fundus region of the stomach? Well, up there we're going to have the lower esophageal sphincter. And what about down here at the pyloric end of the stomach? Down here, we're going to have the pyloric sphincter. And by default, these sphincters are closed. And so they're going to seal off the stomach and allow that food to stay there for about 2 to 4 hours so the stomach can do its job. Where's the stomach located in the abdominal cavity? What quadrant of the abdominal cavity is the stomach located in? Go ahead and picture yourself. This is an anterior view. So picture yourself in the anatomical position, and from the perspective of the patient, what quadrant is the stomach going to be located in? It's going to be the upper left quadrant. All right, so there's a few different digestive activities that are going to occur in the stomach. One is digestion, and specifically the digestion of proteins is going to occur in the stomach, like I briefly mentioned on the previous slide. Another digestive activity is going to be propulsion. Propulsion occurs all through the alimentary canal, and the stomach is no exception. And so the same mechanisms that cause food to move down the esophagus are going to cause food to move down through the stomach. And this occurs via peristalsis. So because of peristalsis, food is going to move from the fundus region of the stomach down to the pylorus region. And this involves the smooth muscle layers of the stomach. To some degree, the longitudinal layer is involved, but to a much larger degree, it's the circular layer of smooth muscle that are causing these rhythmic contractions of the stomach and causing that peristalsis to occur, causing that food to move down from one end of the stomach to another. Anatomically, there's something interesting that's going on in the smooth muscle layers of the stomach. And specifically, there's a third layer called the oblique layer. And this oblique layer is going to contribute to mechanical breakdown. And basically what happens is that down here at the pylorus region of the stomach, this oblique layer kicks in and it really vigorously propels the chyme up against the closed pyloric sphincter. It's really this vigorous peristaltic action that's going on. It propels the chyme up against the pyloric sphincter, and it creates kind of this eddy where it gets propelled around. And by doing so, it's mixing it together and it's breaking it down. And they call this grinding. So again, this kind of vigorous peristalsis, this vigorous mixing of the chyme up against the pyloric sphincter is mixing this chyme together and mechanically breaking it down. And remember, this pyloric sphincter is closed, so what happens is that this mechanical breakdown occurs and this food gets converted into this paste called chyme, then that's going to allow for small amounts of that paste, of that chyme, to squirt through the pyloric sphincter and enter into the small intestine. So here you can see the 3 smooth muscle layers of the stomach. There's the longitudinal layer, there's the circular layer, and there's the innermost oblique layer. But something else that I want to point out is that when the stomach is empty, the mucosa and the submucosal layers of the stomach get thrown into these long, longitudinal folds that we call rugae. And here you can see these large, long, longitudinal folds that are called rugae. And so my question is, what are those there for? What's the purpose of these rugae? And again, these are found in an empty stomach. What does that allow for? Well, what that allows for is that when food comes down into the stomach, those rugae are allowed to stretch, and that allows the stomach to stretch. And that allows the stomach to hold more material, to hold more food. So it allows the stomach to expand and hold more food. Something else that's interesting about these rugae is that there are sensory receptors. There are stretch receptors located in these rugae. And when the rugae flatten out, when the stomach gets filled with food and the rugae flatten out, these sensory receptors, these stretch receptors, are stimulated, and they take that sensory information to the brain, and specifically the hypothalamus. And what does that do? Well, it causes a feeling of satiety. It causes you to feel full. And that makes sense because the stomach is full of food, and so there's plenty of work to do, and there's no need to eat more food. And so it causes that feeling of satiety at the level of the brain. And there are gastric bypass weight loss surgeries that take advantage of these mechanisms. And one of those surgeries is called a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, abbreviated RYGB. And basically what they do, instead of having the whole stomach to fill up with food, what they do is they create a small pouch, a small gastric pouch at the proximal end of the stomach. So the esophagus comes down, and instead of having the whole stomach to deposit this food into, there's just a small gastric pouch. And then what happens is that they have a tube that bypasses the stomach, and it eventually deposits that food into the small intestine. So what are the mechanisms by which this surgery is resulting in weight loss? I can think of two different ways. Well, one has to do with the small size of this gastric pouch. Food comes down the esophagus, and it only takes a small amount of food to fill up this gastric pouch and stretch this gastric pouch. So a small amount of food fills up the pouch, it stretches, and then this sensory information is taken to the hypothalamus, and it results in a feeling of satiety. You feel full much easier with much less food intake. And so you're losing weight just by consuming less food. The other thing that happens is that the food is in this pouch for a much smaller amount of time than it would normally be. And so it doesn't undergo the mechanical breakdown that it normally would. It doesn't get broken down into that paste called chyme. So you have the food in this pouch, and it moves pretty quickly through this tube into the small intestine. And so when it gets to the small intestine, it's not prepared for digestion and absorption of nutrients. Okay, it's not broken down into that nice paste where the enzymes can get at and digest material and absorb them into the bloodstream. And so what happens is that you have much less digestion and absorption of nutrients in the small intestine. So you have less nutrients moving into the bloodstream, and therefore you have less caloric intake. So if we were to look closely at the lining of the stomach, we would see that it's dotted with millions of these gastric pits. And these gastric pits lead into these tubular structures, which are gastric glands. Each one of these tubular structures is considered a gastric gland. And the epithelial cells that line these glands are going to make secretions and collectively produce what we call gastric juice. So these epithelial cells are going to secrete products into the stomach, and collectively that forms gastric juice. And here we have a close-up of some of these epithelial cells. And my question to you is, what type of epithelial cells do these look like? What type of epithelial cells are going to make gastric juice and secrete it into the stomach? And I have that answer right here. This is simple columnar epithelium. Simple columnar epithelium is really good at making products and secreting them. So this gastric juice is going to be acidic, and it's going to contain an enzyme called pepsin. So let's look individually at these things. So first of all, why is the gastric juice going to be acidic? Well, there are these specific simple columnar cells called parietal cells. And those parietal cells are going to secrete hydrochloric acid into the stomach. And that's what makes gastric juice acidic. Gastric juice is also going to contain an enzyme called pepsin. And pepsin is what we call a protease. And what a protease is just a general term for an enzyme that digests proteins. And so these gastric glands are going to produce pepsin, which is a protein digesting enzyme. So because of this hydrochloric acid, the environment of the stomach is extremely acidic. In fact, it's anywhere from pH 1.5 to 3.5, which is extremely acidic. It's acidic enough to digest fingernails if you bite your fingernails and swallow them. But anyways, this acidic environment is intentional. It's actually a good thing. And why is that the case? Why is an acidic environment in the stomach going to be beneficial? Well, I can think of a couple reasons. One of them is that it's going to destroy many of the bacteria that are ingested with food. When you eat food or put anything in your mouth, there's potentially bacteria on it. And so when that gets to the stomach, that acidic environment is going to kill many of those bacteria. The acidic environment of the stomach is also required for protein digestion. Protein digestion begins in the stomach, and an acidic environment is necessary for that to occur. And I'll talk about that on the next couple slides. Now, when would this acidity not be such a good thing? Well, if you've ever eaten foods, maybe spicy foods or other foods that don't agree with you, or consume too much alcohol, what that can do is it can weaken or compromise the contraction of the lower esophageal sphincter. And what that means is that this gastric juice is able to make its way back up through the sphincter and up into the esophagus. And if it gets up there, because of that acidic nature, it's going to burn the lining of the esophagus, and you're going to feel that. And because the esophagus travels near the heart, we often call this heartburn. So let's take a moment to talk about protein digestion. And when I'm talking about protein digestion, I'm talking about breaking the covalent bonds that link amino acids together within that protein chain. Because eventually what we want to do is we want to break all of these individual bonds, and so proteins are broken down into individual amino acids. And this is important because it's only at the single amino acid level that these nutrients are able to cross the intestinal wall and get into the blood, that they're able to be absorbed. So the goal with protein digestion is to break all of these individual covalent bonds, which we call peptide bonds in this case. And so we are left with individual amino acids, because individual amino acids are small enough to move across the intestinal wall and be absorbed. The problem, however, and this is especially true if you've eaten a protein that hasn't been exposed to heat, that hasn't really been cooked or anything, then the protein is most likely going to be in what we call its tertiary or three-dimensional structure. And we can digest proteins to some extent when they're in their 3D dimensional structure, but it's not very efficient. And that's because these individual amino acids, these bonds that hold them together, are all raveled up. They're kind of protected. There's this complex three-dimensional structure. So for efficient digestion to take place, we first have to what we call denature these proteins. And denaturing just refers to the unraveling or the unfolding of a three-dimensional protein into its linear structure. And the acidic environments of the stomach easily denatures these proteins. The reason a protein is in its three-dimensional shape is because you have all these chemical bonds between these amino acid side chains. But if you put those in an acidic environment, those chemical bonds are going to break, the protein is going to unravel, and it's going to take it down to its linear, its primary, or its linear structure. Now, why is this important for digestion, for efficient digestion to occur? Well, this is important because it gives these enzymes access to the individual covalent bonds that link the amino acids together. It exposes them really nice, and so the enzyme can come along and just cleave that covalent bond. Another reason why this acidic environment is important is that it's required for the activation of the protease that we're going to find in the stomach. And that specific protease is called pepsin. So the acidic environment is required for the activation of the protease pepsin. And let's take a look at how that happens. So down here in the gastric glands, we have these specific simple columnar cells called chief cells. And those chief cells are going to make and secrete a molecule called pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is a precursor molecule. It's the molecule that's going to be used to make pepsin. But in and of itself, it has no enzymatic activity. But when pepsinogen is put in an acidic environment, part of that molecule cleaves off and it forms pepsin. So in the presence of an acidic environment, part of the pepsinogen molecule is cleaved off and it forms pepsin, which is the active protease that we're going to find in the stomach. Pepsin is the protease that's going to begin protein digestion. And that's what's being shown over here. We have this denatured protein, which is a string of amino acids. Each of these is a individual amino acid. And pepsin is the first enzyme that's going to come along and start breaking that into smaller components. It's not going to break off individual amino acids, but it's going to start breaking chemical bonds along the way and taking this long polypeptide molecule and making it into a smaller peptide molecule. The next question is, what regulates the secretion of gastric juice? Because the stomach's kind of like a faucet. We want to turn on gastric juice secretion when we need it, and we want to turn it off when we don't. So what's going to stimulate the release of gastric juice? Well, at the level of the brain, just the sight and the thought of food can result in gastric juice secretion. Looking at food, thinking about food, that's all it takes to stimulate gastric juice secretion. And all of those conscious thoughts, that conscious visualization of food, occurs at the level of the cerebral cortex. Then the cerebral cortex is going to send that information to unconscious levels of the brain, namely the hypothalamus and medulla oblongata. And then these levels of the brain are going to activate motor neurons, which travel down the vagus nerve and act on the stomach and stimulate gastric juice secretion. So my question for you is, what type of motor neurons are going to travel through the vagus nerve, act on the stomach, and cause gastric juice secretion? And the answer to that is parasympathetic motor neurons. Remember, the parasympathetic nervous system is activated during periods of resting and digesting. Okay, just chill out. Put on a pair of slippers. And parasympathetic motor neurons travel to effector organs through either cranial nerves or sacral spinal nerves. And guess what? The vagus nerve is most definitely a cranial nerve. What cranial nerve is that? That's cranial nerve 10. So parasympathetic motor neurons travel down the vagus nerve, act on the stomach, and cause gastric juice secretion. And on this same note, the stimulation of taste and smell receptors act through this same pathway, not surprisingly, to stimulate gastric juice secretion. And then most definitely, gastric juice secretion can be stimulated at the level of the stomach. And not surprisingly, this is going to be instigated by stretch of the stomach, distension of the stomach. So you eat a meal, that food goes down into the stomach stretches, the rugae are flattened out, and that activates stretch receptors. And the activation of those stretch receptors is eventually going to result in gastric juice secretion. Well, how does that occur? Well, there's a couple pathways that it can take to do that. One is referred to what we call a long reflex. And all that means is that sensory information is going up to the brain to be processed. So you activate stretch receptors, that sensory information goes up to the brain, specifically to the medulla oblongata, and then the medulla activates parasympathetic motor neurons traveling through the vagus nerve. Those motor neurons act on the stomach and cause gastric juice secretion. So that's referred to as a long reflex. But not surprisingly, this can also happen at the level of the stomach only. And that's referred to as a short reflex. And essentially what's happening there is that you activate a stretch receptor, and then that stretch receptor maybe acts back on another neuron in the lining of the stomach, and then that neuron acts on the stomach and causes gastric juice secretion. And this is working through the enteric nervous system. And so it's acting through neurons that are located within the wall of the stomach itself. That information does not have to go to the brain to stimulate gastric juice secretion. It can work through its own neurons through the enteric nervous system in the wall of the stomach itself. We can also involve the endocrine system into this. So the presence of food chemicals in the stomach can cause gastric juice secretion. And what's going to happen is those food chemicals are going to be detected by simple columnar epithelial cells lining the mucosa, lining the stomach, that are specifically called G cells. And these are endocrine cells. And in response to those food chemicals, they're going to release the hormone gastrin into the blood. And that gastrin is going to travel through the blood. It's going to act on the stomach, and it's going to cause gastric juice secretion. What are some things that can inhibit gastric juice secretion? Well, how about depression? Emotional stress. Both of these psychological events can act on the stomach and inhibit gastric juice secretion. And that's called psychosomatic, where a psychological effect has an effect on another area of the body. And how does this work? Well, depression can work through the cerebral cortex and inhibit parasympathetic activity. So if you inhibit parasympathetic activity, you're inhibiting gastric juice secretion. Emotional stress can do this by activating the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system are antagonistic to each other. Okay, they butt heads with each other. And so the sympathetic nervous system is going to inhibit gastric juice secretion. And the last thing I want to point out about the stomach is that the parietal cells lining the stomach, the same cells that produce hydrochloric acid, are also going to produce a molecule called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is required for the absorption of vitamin B12. It's released into the stomach. It binds to vitamin B12. And for vitamin B12 to move across the intestinal wall into the blood, it has to be bound to intrinsic factor. So it's required for the absorption of vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is important for a number of reasons, but one of those is that it's required for normal red blood cell production. And so if you have a deficiency of vitamin B12, then that can result in a low red blood cell count, what we call a low hematocrit. And when this is the case, when you have a low red blood cell count due to a vitamin B12 deficiency, this is referred to as pernicious anemia. And pernicious anemia is most commonly caused by an autoimmune disease, where the body's immune system is going to attack and destroy the parietal cells lining the stomach. And if it destroys the parietal cells, then you're not getting intrinsic factor released into the stomach, which means you're not getting vitamin B12 absorption. And this can result in serious complications. And at least initially, it needs to be treated by the injection of vitamin B12 directly into the blood.